So to photograph in RAW or JPEG format, the debates have gone on for decades, but has anything changed in 2025? I went out and shot some images in both RAW and JPEG formats, and I'm going to process them in Lightroom so that you can make some informed decisions on what's best for you. It's a good time to revisit this debate on RAW versus JPEG because RAW is now commonly available in smartphones, drones, action cameras and the like. And in this video, I'll mainly be covering how shooting in RAW affects your ability to recover exposure values. But later in the video, I'll also cover other considerations that you need to take into account if you're trying to evaluate whether to adopt either RAW or JPEG. And these are things like file size, non-destructive workflow, and so on. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I'm a professional photographer living in Christchurch, New Zealand, and I make videos on landscape photography and post-processing in Lightroom and Photoshop. First of all, some definitions of what exactly is a RAW file and what's a JPEG file. However, I won't be doing a deep dive into the technical aspects. So a RAW file essentially gives you all of the information that the camera sensor captured, and then the processing of this information is done in programs like Lightroom or Photoshop. This theoretically means that you can still change things like sharpness, white balance, and to a greater or lesser degree exposure after the image has been shot in post-processing software. And traditionally, RAW formats have been lossless formats in that no data is lost in the saving of the file. But lately, lossy formats of RAW files have appeared on the scene. The JPEG format's been around for a long time and could almost be considered the default format of most cameras, smartphones, drones, and action cameras. It is a lossy format, meaning that information is thrown away to reduce the file size. However, usually you can choose the amount of compression in order to either increase the quality or decrease the file size. So here's an image I took in Hagley Park this week. I had the camera set up to shoot both RAW and JPEG files at the same time, so I could do these post-processing tests. Cameras do apply in-camera processing to the JPEG images to make them look good straight out of camera, and this is why they often look better than the unprocessed RAW file. And you do have a lot of in-camera control over how the camera-generated JPEGs look. So I took a series of bracketed exposures, one at the optimal exposure as suggested by the histogram on the back of the camera, and then a darker shot 2 stops underexposed and a lighter shot 2 stops overexposed. Let's see how we get on with processing of these. I'll start by processing the normal exposure, first the RAW file, and then I'll see how close I can get with the JPEG file. So first I'll adjust the exposure, then bring up the shadows slightly and tweak the white balance more to my liking. I'll add in a subtle vignette to draw the viewer into the center. And lastly, add a radial gradient to lighten the area under the trees. I'll do that by adjusting the exposure and shadows in this mask. And finally, add a bit of warmth to the masked area using the color temperature slider. And now let's copy these settings over to the JPEG file and analyze if there's much difference. So here they are side by side, and to be honest, there's not much difference. So the JPEG file would have given as good a result as the RAW file in this normal exposure. Now let's try the lighter exposure, which is 2 stops brighter than ideal. I'm going to turn on the clipping warning and bring the exposure down until this red overexposure warning disappears. I'll follow that up by lowering the highlights and just seeing if the white balance is where we want it. So this doesn't look too bad, though if we compare it to the normally exposed RAW file and zoom in on the pathway area, we can see the overexposed area does look a bit flat and there's some loss of detail. Now let's copy the overexposed RAW settings over to the overexposed JPEG. So straight off we can see it's pretty ugly. The path area has completely lost most of its detail and it's very flat. If we zoom in on both images, you can see that while the overexposed RAW file isn't perfect, it has retained more detail in the highlight areas. So what about the underexposed captures? Can I process the RAW image and get the JPEG to match that? So I'm adjusting the exposure sliders to get the image to where I want it, and I'll add a mask to lighten the shadow areas as I've done before. I'll copy those settings over to the JPEG file and adjust the exposure sliders to match. Let's compare both images and zoom in to see the detail. The JPEG does actually look better than the RAW file. I can see it has had a fair amount of in-camera sharpening applied, and the contrast in the shadows just makes the JPEG file look more vibrant. I'll see if I can match the sharpening in the RAW file by increasing it in the Details tab. As a side note, most image sharpening is best done at the output stage, as it depends on the image size and whether you're outputting to web or print, how much sharpening is actually appropriate. So rather than repeat these processing steps on the other RAW and JPEG file captures, I'm just going to show you the processed images to show you how they would compare in the final end result. So firstly, to the images shot on the wrong white balance setting. Here's the captures, shot with white balance set to tungsten, which could be a mistake you might make when photographing under pressure. And then here's the processed versions where I've tried to correct the white balance. The RAW file, I've been completely able to correct the white balance, but the JPEG file has some weird color shifts in the highlights and shadows, and it's particularly noticeable if we zoom in on these areas. So the reason for the difference is that a RAW capture allows you to change the white balance after capture in processing software, whereas with a JPEG file, the white balance is actually baked into the image, so when you try and correct it, you get these weird shifts in the shadows and the highlights. So onto the high ISO captures. These were shot at 3200 ISO, where I expect to see some noise and image degradation. Straight out of the camera, both the JPEG and the RAW look very similar. The surprising find was that after some basic processing, the JPEG actually looks better. It doesn't mean I can't get more from the RAW file, but not without quite a lot of processing, I suspect. The JPEG file looks particularly cleaner in the black areas. The contrast in the shadows, it just looks more natural in the JPEG image. Now on to a more high contrast capture. So once again, I captured these as normally exposed, which is judged by the histogram on the back of the camera. Then I underexposed 2 stops and overexposed 2 stops. And here are the processed versions. So even with the normal exposure, I can see the highlights and the transitions between shadow and highlights are much cleaner in the processed RAW file. If we have a look at the overexposed version, I can see that the RAW file, or even the RAW file, has lost detail in the highlight areas, though not as much as the JPEG. And I admit that the RAW file didn't do as well as I expected compared to the in-camera JPEG capture. And it's in the underexposed captures where things get interesting. So both files are actually okay, though there were some color twists in the JPEG file, which meant I couldn't leave much blue in the sky. And there's also a strange thing happening in the darkest shadows where they're blocking up to a very flat blue, which is kind of weird. But both files performed pretty well. And now if I compare the normally exposed processed RAW file with the underexposed RAW file, there's really not that much difference. Maybe slightly more noise in the shadows, but not so much that anyone would notice, I think. So here's the processed versions of a RAW and a JPEG capture from a recent trip to the Molesworth. So the JPEG hasn't done too badly considering the range of brightness in the scene. But you can see the color twists in the JPEG file, particularly on the sun star where it decreases in brightness. The color shift is possibly the biggest problem I have when I need to push JPEGs a lot in post-processing. So the RAW file seems to handle exposure shifts much more cleanly. Here's another shot from the Molesworth. The JPEG hasn't done too badly considering the contrast range, though it doesn't show the range of colour in the sky that the processed RAW file does. And although the shadow detail is very dark and you can't really see much of it, the shadows in the JPEG are a bit messy and would show up if you wanted to push them to a bit brighter. So here's some other things to consider if you're weighing up whether to shoot RAW or JPEG. So file size is the obvious one. On my Sony 7R4 camera, the JPEG file, the equivalent JPEG file, maximum resolution, maximum quality, is still well under half the file size of a RAW file. So if storage is an issue for you, then maybe that is a consideration. And also it takes longer to copy files and to read files. You'll also lose a bit of your frames per second burst rate if that's something you do a lot of. The second point is that RAW lends itself more to a non-destructive workflow. That is, it's generally pretty hard to overwrite a RAW file accidentally, whereas a JPEG file you could downsize the resolution, change it to black and white, and then accidentally overwrite it, and you'll never recover all of that original data. So I really like the non-destructive workflow of the RAW file process. And another point is RAW processing software has improved a lot over time. So theoretically, you can process older RAW files and get a lot more out of them. For example, Adobe are up to version 6 of their RAW processing software, and they've added a lot to it in that time. So here are my main takeaways from this RAW versus JPEG experiment. In-camera captures have come a long way since the early days, and that's JPEG and RAW files. It used to be that all the noise and digital artifacts would really show up in the shadows, so as soon as you enhance them, they would look really ugly. But I think that's got a lot better, so much so that the old mantra of exposed to the right, which was expose your captures to the right of the histogram so that you avoided getting too much shadow detail, is not so important. And I think I'll pay less attention to that going forward because the shadows are just much cleaner. And also in practice, I've found that even although the histogram says I've got a correct exposure, sometimes in a high contrast image, those highlight areas are still better in a slightly underexposed image. So I think I'll stick to exposing more to the middle of the histogram rather than pushing everything to the right. Another thing I noticed from my experiment is that even though JPEG files have improved a lot since the early days of cameras, it still pays to get as much right as possible in camera if you're shooting JPEG files, because if you have to push them too much in post-processing, they do start to get funny color shifts and it's just much more difficult. And lastly, although JPEG files have improved a lot in cameras since the early days, I'm still going to stick to shooting in RAW because I really like the non-destructive workflow, and even if it only gives me a 10 or 15% advantage, I'll take that because storage cost isn't really a big consideration for me. It's getting cheaper all the time. And also the increased time it takes to copy files and to read files, that's not really an issue for me either. So I'll stick to RAW for now. So thanks for watching and hope to see you in the next one.